Americans pay taxes that fund roads, schools, public safety, national defense, and countless other public services. Those taxes are just one part of the whole story because debates over taxation often focus on individuals and omit the role of corporations. Why do we ask corporations to pay taxes, and how much should they pay? How do we know what a fair share of taxation would look like? Is it problematic to democratic governance when profitable corporations avoid significant portions of their tax liability? To explore these questions, I am pleased to welcome Amy Hanauer, Executive Director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Amy has spent her career researching tax policy, economic inequality, and public investment, and her work helps explain how tax systems shape opportunity, economic growth, and democratic governance. Today, we'll discuss corporate taxation, tax avoidance, and why many economists and policy scholars believe these issues are more important than just the revenue itself. Hello, I am Marvin King, and this is Civic Lens. Amy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Marvin, thank you so much for having me on.
Glad you're here. To begin, what first drew you to studying tax policy?
I just realized that taxes were a big part of figuring out who gets what in this society. It's the main way that we can determine whether the wealthy get wealthier, whether the low and moderate income families have access to college and to healthcare and to many of the basics. And I just realized that a lot of hidden things go on in the tax code while the rest of us are focused on some sort of culture war fight over here. We're quietly seeing the moneyed interests kind of enrich the wealthiest and impoverish the rest of us. And so I wanted to be on the inside understanding that.
So, why do corporations get taxed at all if individuals working for those companies already pay individual income taxes? What's the logic there?
Yeah. Well, first, taxes are taxes on corporate profits. And so there are many corporations that make enormous profits and don't have many employees at all. So just taxing the workers doesn't get at that revenue. So if you think about tech companies or oil companies or hedge funds, some of those entities generate billions of dollars for their shareholders with just hundreds or just thousands of employees. And then you think about other businesses that are much, much more labor intensive, like a McDonald's or a Starbucks or a supermarket chain. And that would lead to really big inequities in how these entities are taxed. But the other thing is that about 40% of corporate profits go to foreign investors. So if we didn't tax corporate profits, it would mean that money left the country entirely. And corporate shareholders are just much, much wealthier than the rest of us. So when we have a weak corporate tax code, it really kind of supercharges inequality because about 75% of the benefits of corporate tax cuts go to either foreign investors or the richest 5% of Americans. So there's lots and lots of reasons that we should tax corporations.
My understanding of this is that most Americans assume that corporations will pay whatever tax rate Congress establishes, much like when I am filling out my 1040. There's a rate. It shows what my income is plus my wife's. And so we figure out what bracket we're in. And so then we pay the tax. And maybe I get a deduction or two if I've got kids or a house. But otherwise, it's fairly simple. I'm going to pay whatever bracket I slot in. But my understanding is that in reality, the effective tax rate paid by companies often varies far more considerably than that simple process it is for the individual. So why is that?
Well, you're 100% right. And so my organization is the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And so your listeners can find some of the data that I'm going to talk about here at itep.org, itep.org. And you're absolutely right. 88 profitable corporations paid zero taxes last year on billions in profits. And this included companies like Tesla, United Airlines, Yum Brands, PayPal, CVS. I mean, they all paid nothing. And then there's a lot of other corporations that have avoided, they don't pay zero, but they pay very, very low rates, far below the corporate rate, despite being really profitable. So you're right.
How do they do this? Are they
Yeah,
putting their money in a mattress and just not telling the government they made money? How does this?
right.
I know it's complicated, but could you kind of give us a scaled down version of what this process looks like?
Yeah, I mean, so Congress has put in place a huge number of tax breaks for corporations, ostensibly to encourage certain behavior. And some of those, have some rationale behind them. So they can, corporations can write off capital investments. They can write off research and development expenses. They can write off expenses for machinery and equipment. They can write off interest payments. They can write off certain stock exemptions. Um, they can carry forward net operating losses from a prior year. And so some of these like make some sense. Like I think the initial rationale was, oh, it's hard for a corporation to invest in new machinery and they need they need some sort of a tax break to enable them to do that. And that may not be totally irrational on the part of Congress, but they've just grown to such a large extent, and corporations kind of game the system using net operating losses from an earlier year to write off profits for decades, or using these capital equipment investments to write off their entire tax bill.
If I were to interview the Chamber of Commerce, they would say that this isn't tax avoidance. This is just Congress incentivizing research and development or investment, and therefore the tax code is amenable to that. So, is what you're describing what we mean by tax avoidance?
Right. You're drawing a really good distinction, and we do talk about this as tax avoidance. Most of it is legal. It's not all legal, but most of it is legal. And we tend to talk about tax evasion when we're talking about illegal tax avoidance. Um, and you're right. I mean, I don't know that we need to blame the corporations as much as we should be blaming Congress for doing this. They are the ones that are enabling it. Now that said, there are sometimes corporations write up things for their own shareholders that they talk about something called uncertain tax benefits, which is when they've done something that they know a really empowered and well-resourced IRS might find to be illegal, but they're doing it anyway, and they have to disclose that to their shareholders. So that's kind of funny. One of my more expert colleagues often writes about these uncertain tax benefits. But leaving that aside, most of this is illegal, and most of this is legal, and we should blame Congress for it. And it's not tax evasion, it's just tax avoidance.
You're saying Congress is responsible because at the end of the day, they're the one writing the law. But I can also imagine in this scenario, Chamber of Commerce type organizations, if not the corporations themselves, probably lobby for this. And I was just thinking of this because you mentioned a weakened IRS. And who is most likely to benefit from a weakened IRS would be these corporations. I don't feel empowered to engage in tax avoidance with my own taxes because I can't afford a lawyer to defend me. And so the incentives are very different.
Absolutely. And the vast majority of your taxes, if you earn your money the way most of us do, primarily from a job, the vast majority of your taxes are just deducted from your paycheck. So, yeah, you don't have the same ability to engage in this gamesmanship, and you don't have the same um, complex code to rely on. And that is why, so you're exactly right. And you're 100% right that corporations lobby for this. And this is part of what we were I think you saw an article we wrote in Democracy Journal. This is part of what we were talking about is like corporations demand the certain kind of tax code. They put money into elections to elect a set of leaders that are more likely to defer to their wishes. Then they put money into lobbying to get the outcomes that they want. And as I mentioned, often this is really complicated for regular people to understand. And that's one of the fundamental reasons that an organization like mine, ITEP, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, it's one of the fundamental reasons we exist, is because we think that regular people should be able to know something about the tax code that steers our lives and steers our ability to get the basics for our kids. We have more than enough money in this country to have universal health care, to have much more affordable college access, to have childcare. But a lot of it is just tied up in corporate profits and in the incomes of very wealthy people.
So years ago, the influential economist Milton Friedman, he wrote what became known as the Friedman Doctrine, which argues that a corporation's number one responsibility is to the shareholder. It was in a op-ed in the New York Times. Do you think this logic of responsibility to the shareholder is behind corporate tax avoidance, and that corporations see, their number one responsibility is to maximize profits?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of corporate behavior that kind of follows that. And, pay less in wages, pay less in checking whether they've allowed a disease onto their lettuce before they distribute it around the country and make all of us sick. Reduce the ways in which they're complying with environmental regulation. And so I think that a doctrine like Milton Friedman's, I mean, I'm not crazy about it in the first place, but it only works with a strong public sector. And it actually only works for corporations and for consumers and for workers and for all of us who breathe this air and drink this water. It only works with a strong public sector. And that's, I think, the problem in the United States. In comparison with other countries. And it's part of the reason why we have less healthcare and shorter lifespans and more of this kind of disease outbreak than a lot of other wealthy democracies, is because we underinvest in a lot of things that could help keep corporations in check. I think something like that Friedman Doctrine is made much worse when you have empowered corporations and weakened public sector. And we saw that with Donald Trump empowering Elon Musk through his so-called Doge efforts to just lay off vast swaths of public sector workers, the precise people who are charged with monitoring the safety of our food supply, with monitoring the safety of our public health, with enforcing environmental law and enforcing labor law. And that's a real problem for us.
You've kind of answered my next question, which was in reference to that article in the Democracy Journal, which I'll be sure to include a link of in the show notes. It seems that your argument was that, yes, corporations should pay more in taxes, not just for the economic reasons of what the money can provide, although that's important, but in terms of democratic governance.
Yeah, I just think we are seeing right now excessive power over policymaking by the tech billionaires, four of whom showed up at Trump's inauguration, and they have gotten really big favors from this administration, not only in terms of lower taxes, but in terms of deregulation and in terms of mergers. There's just a number of ways in which this particular administration is even more sort of craven in their embrace of big money and use of it to enrich themselves, that the Trump family, and to enrich the wealthiest donors that give to them. So, I don't think democracy functions very well when plutocrats sort of run the government. And I heard somebody say recently, taxes fight fascism. And I think that there's a lot to that. If we have an adequate tax code, first of all, regular people will get more of the reasonable public goods. Right now, I think we have very unequal access to those public goods. And I don't know that you can call it a functioning democracy when huge numbers of people are having their health care taken away, right? Like that just feels like a basic ability to participate in society relies on being able to pay the doctor when you have to go to the doctor or when your kids do. Similarly with education or with transportation, or we're increasingly seeing with housing. So I think the excessive power that the uber rich have over policymaking, including by demanding a more acquiescent tax code, is really bad for democracy.
At the same time, individuals then have to pay there's a greater burden on them to pay for the services that we do get.
We see that play out in the variation among state tax codes, which is that, in many, many states, the tax code is completely upside down, where the wealthiest people pay the lowest share of their income in taxes, and low and moderate income people pay a higher share of their income in taxes. And what that means is not only that government is generally going to be underfunded, but it just means that the tax code in those states is actually increasing inequality rather than reducing inequality. And it's really, really problematic. And I will say a lot of states are starting to push back on this. So it's exciting. I mean, despite the challenges of this time, it's really exciting to see the ways that a lot of states are trying to fix this.
In Mississippi right now, the governor and the state legislature are working on a plan to phase out the state income tax. We have a very high sales tax, and we're one of the few states that charges sales tax on groceries. How would you say that sort of tax regime might contribute to inequality?
Absolutely. So my organization does a report called Who Pays, which looks at the state tax systems in every state in the country and determines the degree to which the wealthiest, the middle, or the lowest income families kind of shoulder that tax burden. And we find that states like Mississippi that are trying to get rid of their income tax, or states that have already gotten rid of their income tax, end up with a tax system where regular people pay a lot more of their income in taxes. And yeah, it's incredibly problematic. I believe 6 states right now kind of on a race to the bottom trying to get rid of their income taxes entirely. Now, no state has gotten rid of its income tax entirely since Alaska did so like over 50 years ago. And that's because most of the states that don't have an income tax, like Florida, Oklahoma, Alaska, have some sort of other source of income like oil or tourism that enables them to still have a kind of functioning tax code without it, albeit one that's much more regressive where regular people pay a lot higher share. Um, so they may not get there entirely, but you're right that they're on a race to do so. I'll just say one thing, which is that there were also 4 states that passed new top brackets on income over $1 million in the last legislative session. So that's really exciting. It's going to kind of exacerbate disparities among states if some states are taxing the people who earn more than $1 million a year and using it to buy better education, better healthcare, better services for regular people, and Mississippi can't. So you're right to be concerned.
I use Massachusetts as an example of a state that a few years ago enacted a high wealth or high income tax and how they have used that money to provide for more public services. And not surprisingly, Massachusetts ranks far higher than Mississippi in terms of educational attainment, healthcare outcomes. One of the fears was that all the rich people would leave Massachusetts, and the evidence to this point says they haven't. And I bring that up because, playing devil's advocate, critics, I think, of the ITEP approach would argue you need to lower corporate taxes because that encourages investment and innovation and job creation. And otherwise, it simply forces corporations to relocate or lay off workers. What does the evidence suggest to that kind of counterpoint?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And, the truth is that corporations actually need an adequate and well-funded government because that is what gives people the faith to buy their products. It's what enables them to avoid, having competitors that can undercut them. Um, I think people are going to be a lot more comfortable going out and buying lettuce again when we know that our food supply is safe again. So it hasn't been great for Taylor Farms that they were permitted to do this. And we know that corporations really depend on a well-educated workforce. They depend on research that comes from well-funded university systems. They depend on solid infrastructure to get their products out to market. So it doesn't really benefit corporations to have this downward race to the bottom. Um, in terms of at the international level, the truth is that, like right now, there are only 3 other wealthy democracies, that's countries that are in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. There are only 3 other member countries out of 38 that collected less corporate revenue as a share of their GDP than the United States, and these were Latvia, Estonia, and Slovakia. On average, these OECD countries collect more than twice as much corporate tax revenue as a share of their GDP than the US does. This really contributes to our low spending, our lack of investment in our communities. And so, that's why basics that are kind of a routine part of the social contract in Germany or France or Sweden, like universal health care, like low-cost childcare, like affordable college, are missing here. So I think it's a real mistake to think that corporations or people benefit from this kind of a low tax regime. In the end, we all kind of are harmed by it.
And I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but when you think of the federal budget and then the deficit, one reason that we would be running such a large deficit is we leave on the table billions of dollars a year in taxes. So then that leads to higher interest payments or more interest payments that the government has to make, which then crowd out spending on healthcare, education, other public services. If you could wave your magic wand and get Congress to significantly reduce corporate tax avoidance, what 1 or 2 reforms would you start with?
Yes, I love when people give me a magic wand, so thank you for that. I mean, first is, that a few years ago, the United States negotiated with all of our international trading partners to put in place a global minimum tax. And a lot of our trading partners have started to do that. And it's a great idea because it eliminates that kind of collective action problem that you were describing earlier. Because right now you have corporations like hiding their profits in Barbados or Ireland or the Cayman Islands. And it's not benefiting any of the places where they employ workers or where they sell their products. It's just sort of profits in name only. So implementing that global minimum tax would be very, very good for the United States. And if we fail to do so, it's going to harm us because these other countries have agreed to it and started to implement it, and we kind of backed out. But what we're going to see is that soon, profits of our own corporations that could be helping people in Mississippi or Rhode Island or Maine or whatever will be benefiting instead German people in Germany and France and Switzerland. So I think that would be a good start. Second is getting rid of something called the pass-through loophole. There was initially something called this pass-through tax break. It was designed to allow small companies that were mostly just owned by a few individuals to avoid the corporate income tax and the benefits of being a corporation. But it's been spread and spread and spread so that now, like the Trump Corporation is considered a pass-through. There are a lot of really enormous entities that call themselves pass-throughs and kind of get around that. So I would get rid of that. And then after that, I'd raise the rate. The Trump administration cut the corporate tax rate twice, both in 2017 with TCJA, and then extending that with the OBBBA, Trump's tax bill from this time. And that, it doesn't make any sense to cut the rate so low because corporations don't even pay the rate. We might as well have it at a higher level, get rid of some of these loopholes and collect that revenue.
And my understanding is a lot of that money just went back to stock buybacks.
100% true.
The corporations just essentially use that money then to pump up their own value of their own stock.
That's right.
And
That's right.
Instead of putting it into R&D or investment or manufacturing. So thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And listeners know that I always encourage learning after the episode is over. So what might you recommend to someone who wants to dig deeper into tax policy or economic inequality or public finance? Any places that you would recommend they start their learning journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, so that my comms director doesn't kill me, I'll say go to itep.org and see, you can find some of the citations of things I've been talking about. But Vanessa Williamson has a new book called The Price of Democracy, The Revolutionary Power of Taxation in American History. It's a really fun read, actually. It's a great book, and it gives you a sense of some of the interplay between taxation and democracy, some of the reasons why we should all want to be contributors and why actually historically Americans are much more in favor of paying taxes than kind of the popular myths would have us think. So I strongly recommend that book. And if I can get away with one more,
Please do.
yeah. I recently read Paper Girl by Beth Macy. I spent a lot of my career in Ohio, and she is a journalist who grew up in Southern Ohio, in a small working class town. And she kind of goes back and finds a young person who she thinks has a similar demographic to what she had, which was kind of marginal economically, but she feels that she was given so many more opportunities than a similarly situated young person today. And she also does a really good job of kind of unraveling some of the racist, some of the anti-government, some of the kind of um, anti-fact forces that have taken sway in her hometown. So it's called Paper Girl by Beth Macy. Really fun read.
Those are great recommendations. And I'll put links to The Price of Democracy and Paper Girl, as well as the Democracy Journal article that we talked about earlier. I'll put all those in the show notes. Amy Hanauer from ITEP, thank you so much for your time. This has been
This
great.
was so much fun. Thank you, Marvin. Anytime.
Thanks for listening. Really hope you enjoyed the episode. Help us reach more people by subscribing to the podcast and sharing this episode. Leave a comment too. That really helps. Thank you and have a great day.